Week 11, Overview. Ancient China, Confucius and Taoism. This week, we'll continue our 3-week eastward trip around the globe with a stop in ancient China, the world's oldest living civilization. The people of China call their land the Middle Country, the center of their universe. For thousands of years, they've tended to ignore what's happened on their periphery. Empires rose and fell in Mesopotamia and the Mediterranean while China pursued its own path. The Chinese people as a whole didn't even realize there were other civilized people on the planet until about 126 BC. The Chinese civilization is fascinating to study. If you've never looked at it before, you'll be amazed at the ingenuity they displayed. They were using many key inventions well before their Western counterparts. We'll survey their art, literature, and architecture, which have amazed mankind for centuries. We'll also study their religious beliefs and their development during the earliest years of their existence. China is a vast nation with dramatically different regions. It's surrounded by vastness, too. The Himalayas wall it off from India to the south, the Pacific bounds it on the east, and to the north lie the endless steppes of Mongolia and Siberia. The Taklamakan Desert to the west was practically impassable. In Chinese, Taklamakan means, "Enter and you shall never return." Whenever China has bumped up against other peoples, Chinese culture has generally dominated. Korea, Mongolia, and Japan have all grown up in China's shadow, to some extent. Now, as with almost every other ancient civilization we've studied this year, the earliest Chinese civilization developed along a great river, the Huanghe, Chinese for Yellow River. China is arguably the oldest civilization on Earth. It may be the most stable society Earth has never known. The Chinese Empire existed continuously from 221 BC to 1912 AD. The earliest Chinese civilization began on the Huanghe, or Yellow River, and seems to have flowered around 3000 BC. It's known as the Yanshao culture. The Longshan culture superseded it and spread across the eastern third of China. The Longshan people lived in walled cities, and they raised rice. The first Chinese dynasty came from this Longshan culture around 1700 BC, at about the time the Aryans were wiping out the Indus Valley cities. The Shang dynasty ruled a society governed by a class of hereditary nobles. Their horse-drawn chariots made them fearful in war, and their system of writing enabled them to develop an advanced culture. From ancient times, the Chinese have believed in the spirits of nature and in the spirits of their ancestors. When a nobleman died, they killed his servants so that they could serve their masters in the afterlife. Later, they began to use clay statues of servants and courtiers instead of human sacrifices. As with Egypt, much of what we know about ancient China comes from studying their burial sites. The Zhou people in the west of China were herdsmen and farmers who fell under the rule of the Shangs. Around 1120 BC, when the Shangs were distracted by war on the east, the Zhou invaded. They overthrew the city in one day, and the king of the Shangs, seeing he had lost the battle, killed himself by jumping into a fire. The Zhou had won the war, but how could they keep the peace? There weren't all that many Zhou, so they had to be clever to hold on to power. According to their records, they persuaded the Shang people that their king deserved to lose. He was greedy, corrupt, negligent, and cruel. The Zhou told the Shang that heaven itself had turned against him. That was why they had won. This notion of the mandate of heaven became an important and lasting part of the Chinese conception of government. Each king or emperor ruled because heaven ordained it. But a ruler could lose the mandate of heaven, and then it was the right and the duty of the people to replace him. The Zhou succeeded in persuading the more numerous and powerful Shang to accept their rule, in part by creating a form of feudalism that relied on existing Shang nobles. They expanded their kingdom by giving away power. The Zhou dynasty is the longest-lasting reign by one family in the history of the planet, an unbroken streak of rulers from 1122 to 256 BC. For a total of 866 years. But the length of the Zhou rule was not matched by its strength. Delegating power to lesser lords made it possible for the Zhou to rule a large kingdom, but difficult to control their squabbling vassals. There was also the constant pressure from foreign invaders, like the Mongols to the north, which made things difficult. With battling warlords inside the kingdom and hostile tribes outside, the Zhou kingdom fell into serious trouble. Historians call the period from 700 BC on the Warring States period. The warlords had huge armies and powerful weapons. Some of the warlords could field 100,000 men in battle. Bronze weapons were improved by adding tin to make them harder. The Chinese invented the crossbow sometime around 400 BC, which could pierce armor. Chinese law prohibited anyone from exporting these superweapons out of China. This time of strife had a great impact on one man. The scholar, Confucius, was born around 550 BC, near the time of Buddha. It was a time when warlords were tearing China apart. People were losing confidence in their own society, and they were turning their backs on tradition. It looked as if the end of civilization itself might be at hand. Confucius fought back by teaching his disciples to live as gentlemen. China had plenty of gentlemen in one sense, but they were nobles who were becoming increasingly savage. Confucius says it was not breeding but behavior that made one a gentleman. His idea of a gentleman was a man who was reverent, respectful, intelligent, studious, self-controlled. Confucius taught in memorable sayings, which your older children will be reading this week. He taught a version of the Golden Rule. What you do not wish for yourself, do not do to others. He said, a gentleman will take as much trouble to discover what was right as lesser men take to discover what will pay. Confucius provides an opportunity for Christian students to cultivate an appropriate respect for Eastern thought without falling into theological error. The teachings of Confucius do not, for the most part, directly contradict Christianity, largely because Confucius intentionally focused on this world, thus avoiding most of the explicitly religious issues. Although he repeatedly spoke of heaven, Confucius did not teach any specific religious doctrines. He seems to have simply taken the existing Chinese religious beliefs for granted. Confucianism can be summed up in one Chinese word, Zhen, which can be loosely translated as humanism. Unlike secular humanism, which denies any divinity, or its close cousin religious humanism, which substitutes the worship of humanity for the worship of God, Confucius taught an emphasis on humaneness that didn't conflict with traditional Chinese spirituality. But does it conflict with Christianity? In my opinion, no, at least not directly, which provides a real apologetic opportunity. In Luke 7:35, Jesus said, "Wisdom is justified by all her children." This week's pageant of philosophy offers you and your older child an opportunity to meet Confucius yourself. Confucius was never famous in his lifetime, but his disciples spread his teachings. His vision of an ordered society and a disciplined life provoked a backlash. Taoism developed in part as a reaction against Confucianism. Where Confucius taught that the good life consists of living as a gentleman, the Taoist ideal is a person who avoids the artificial restrictions of society and lives a simple life of meditation close to nature. To some degree, Taoism is based on the teachings of Lao Tzu, but Taoism has never been a single, unified entity. Some scholars divide it into three distinct movements: philosophical Taoism, religious Taoism, and folk Taoism. As a philosophy, Taoism teaches that there's a flow to the universe, a force behind the natural order. It emphasizes the balance of nature, which is expressed visually by the yin-yang symbol. As a religion, Taoism has priests and temples, and then folk Taoism includes what we might call traditional Chinese religion, including much magic, superstition, polytheism, idolatry, and ancestor worship. Taoism left its mark on Chinese art. If you've ever paid any attention to Chinese art, you've probably noticed beautiful nature scenes like willows or mountains or birds on a branch. That's Taoism represented in art. Taoism and Confucianism arose during the Warring States period, while the Zhou were still technically in power. As the years went by, though, the warlords wiped each other out until there were only 7 large states left. In 221 BC, Ying Sheng of the Qin state wiped out the other 6 warlords one by one. Sheng declared himself Shi Huangdi, which means the first great emperor. An empire is different from a kingdom. A king rules over a single nation or people, while an emperor rules over a collection of nations. Emperor Shi Huangdi spent his whole life looking for a potion that would let him live forever. He didn't find one, so he prepared one of the greatest tombs of all time. Archaeologists found his tomb in 1974, and they've been excavating it ever since. They found over 7,000 life-size terracotta statues so far, an entire army to accompany him into the next world. There are crossbow archers, foot soldiers, cavalry. There are generals with horses and chariots. Emperor Shi Huangdi didn't beat death, but his terracotta army tells us a lot about how he fought his wars. Emperor Shi Huangdi opposed Confucianism. He mandated a doctrine called legalism. He imposed the Qin state's centralized bureaucracy on all of China, displacing the hereditary nobles who had ruled during the Zhou period. He abolished all the local states, and he set up a strong central government. He standardized weights, measures, money, and writing. He dealt with foreign invaders by ordering the construction of the Great Wall of China to shield China from Mongolia. There was a significant resistance to these changes, though, and to the heavy taxes they required. But Emperor Shi Huangdi enforced his rules with a heavy hand. Officials who protested against him were thrown into a pit and buried alive. This method of government worked for a while, but when he died, the empire erupted into civil war. Liu Bang was an ugly peasant with 72 black moles on his skin. He led a rebellion against the heir to the Qin throne, and he took the throne himself. He began what is known as the Han Dynasty. As soon as he took power, he replaced the corrupt and incompetent government officials with bright but ordinary men. His reforms worked, and his family held on to power for the next 422 years. The Han rulers adopted Confucianism as the official philosophy of the state. They believed the teachings of Confucius would help to unify and order the empire. In 124 BC, the government established the Imperial University to educate future government officials in Confucian ideals. They established a system of public schools for boys in every part of China to teach them Confucianism. From then until 1912, Confucian thinking has had an enormous influence over Chinese society. The Han period was remarkable. Over 1 million people lived in the capital city 2,000 years ago. As your children learn about life in Imperial China, they should notice quite a few similarities with life in the West today. They used music for entertainment and gave gifts at special times each year. They traveled by roads or dug canals. They made paper and had printing presses. They had compasses. They even developed earthquake detectors. Then, as now, officials had to take tests to qualify for their jobs. Your children may not realize how surprising all these developments are, but if your family comes from the north of Europe, your ancestors may have been Viking berserkers, or Druids painting themselves blue, while the Chinese dressed in silk and sipped tea from exquisite porcelain dishes. One thing your children will notice is the difference in writing. We use an alphabet of 26 simple symbols to spell out any sound. The Chinese use pictographs, so their alphabet consists of thousands of characters. To read the simplest newspaper, you need to know at least 3,000 characters. The smallest Chinese dictionary has 6,000 characters. There are well over 40,000 separate pictographs to learn. Chinese writing may have held back the development of their culture. The Chinese were the first to invent the printing press, but they turned their back on movable type for the less flexible block printing. Block printing means that a whole page full of text is carved into a wooden block, which is then inked and used to print hundreds of copies. Around AD 1000, a Chinese man named Bi Sheng also invented movable type, which involves lots of little stamps, one for each character of the alphabet, that must be assembled into a page of text. His letters were made of clay, but his press wasn't popular in China because Chinese writing has so many characters. One would have had to create, store, and access all these for even the simplest documents, so the custom carving of block printing made more sense in the end. The West didn't invent printing with movable type until Johannes Gutenberg in the 15th century, but once it did, the 26 letters of the Western alphabet made movable type the way to go. The West started printing Bibles and hasn't stopped since. Buddhism came to China during the Han Dynasty. Gautama Buddha was born in India in 563 BC, during the lifetime of Confucius, but it took centuries for his teachings to make it to China. Buddhism spread through China in the 1st century AD, just when Christianity was spreading through the Roman Empire. What I find most amazing about the Chinese Empire is that it lasted from 220 BC to AD 1912. The second most amazing fact is, how could such an enormous nation have so little impact on the West? Geography played a large part in isolating China, but so did self-sufficiency. By and large, there's nothing outside China that interested it enough to bother with. There were foreign invaders who tried to take China on, but most decided to let China be. Alexander the Great wanted to tackle China after he conquered India in 326 BC, but his Greek troops refused to go. More than 2,000 years later, after Napoleon Bonaparte had conquered most of Europe, his generals asked him what he would conquer next. China, they suggested? No, Napoleon answered. Let China sleep, for when she awakes, she will shake the world. China was a sleeping giant of the 20th century. We'll study her again in year 2 when we cover Marco Polo, and then again in year 4 as she finally begins to wake.